Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. So today's a significant day. In Germany, they shut down the last of their nuclear power plants. They had 17, and this was a demand of the Green Party going back to its origins in the late 1970s. So let's be happy about that. But the bigger picture on nuclear power is not good. Currently, there are 55 new nuclear power plants being built around the world, including in the US, two enormous cost overruns and time delays in Georgia. They're building them in Britain, Finland, France, and they all have cost overruns and construction delays. And the same time and money, if it was put into more solar and wind, would create a lot more energy capacity. So there's not a rational reason to be building nuclear power plants at this point. And just take France, which is about 70% dependent on nuclear power for its electricity. They have 57 or 56 nuclear power plants. And more they have to be shut down because of climate change. Rivers are running too low or too hot so to cool the plants. So in the summertime, when they need a lot of electricity for air conditioning, the nukes aren't running. And half the nukes were shut down this fall in France for refueling and repairs for their aging components. This is an aging fleet of nuclear power plants. And right now, there's still a dozen of them shut down. So they say nuclear power is reliable, not so much. The United States still has 92 nuclear reactors operating of the 104 that were built. That means 12 have been closed. And there's 7 that were scheduled to close by 2025, but they're being kept open, even though they're losing money, and their owners wanted to shut them down. They're being kept open by subsidies in New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Connecticut, Illinois, and California. And I may have left a state out. And note that all those states, except for Ohio, are controlled by Democrats. All of the above energy policy we've heard since Obama is still in effect, and Biden is very pro-nuclear. It's in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which I call the Build Back Badly Act. The real proliferator of nuclear reactors is Russia. They've built 1 in 5 nukes around the world, and its state-owned nuclear power company, Rosatom, is building 15 more right now. In countries like Turkey, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Finland, Argentina, China, India, Egypt, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And some of those haven't started in some of those countries, but they're on the way. And in fact, Russia has signed nuclear cooperation agreements with 50 countries. And meanwhile, just to show you, we remember Chernobyl, but what is it now? 4 years ago, in 2019, Russia launched a barge with 2 floating nuclear power plants on it into the Arctic Ocean. And its purpose, it's docked outside of Pevek in Siberia over toward Alaska. And its purpose is to power oil drilling. Greenpeace calls it Chernobyl on ice. And, that's the first of 8 of these barges that Russia plans to launch into the Arctic Ocean with nukes on them. What could go wrong? And they're not to power green or pink hydrogen, they would call it, or something like that. It's to power oil drilling and gas drilling, and also mining operations. This is not green development. And then look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They seized the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, where nuclear workers report there's heavy Russian military equipment being stored on the site. There's garbage all over the place, which is creating a fire hazard. And the plant is being unsafely operated and maintained because now Rosatom is coming to take over from the Ukrainian atomic company, and they're forcing workers to sign contracts with Rosatom. If they refuse, they get fired. And this is from a letter that was passed on to me from a nuclear worker in Zaporizhia. They're hiring people off the street, even alcoholics and drug addicts, to take the place of skilled workers, or even maintenance workers, around the site. And it's a very dangerous situation. And then recall that Russia, when they first invaded a year ago, they occupied the Chernobyl nuclear disaster site. They had it for a month, and they retreated. There are a lot of reports that the soldiers that were there got radiation sickness because they were digging trenches into the soil that's contaminated around the reactor. And they just dismissed the radiation dangers. There's actually a story in the New York Times today about a older lady who stayed within the exclusion area. And when the Russians came, they told her what could happen with radiation in the ground. So the nuclear safety issues there are a real concern, and just shows that the Russian state really didn't have much concern about the safety issues with nuclear power, or even for their own troops. And the thing to note is that with all these Western countries importing uranium from Russia and other components of the nuclear supply chain, and actually getting help from Russia to build their nuclear power plants or maintain them, there are no sanctions on Russia's nuclear industry, which makes your head scratch. So right now, the world has 439 nuclear reactors operating in 30 countries, with 55 more under construction. And this is not just a worry about the pollution and accident hazards and what you do with the waste from nuclear power plants. Nuclear power can lead to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I mean, why do you think militarized and imperialistic countries like Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia want nuclear technology? I mean, this is nuclear madness. So I think as Germany shuts down its last nuclear power plant today, and as the Ukraine war brings to the forefront the dangers of nuclear power, Zaporizhia, Chernobyl, and the threats of tactical nuclear weapons by the Russian leadership, that should push our anti-nuclear demands to the forefront. And we should be demanding, instead of just watching, the phase out of nuclear power as renewables are phased in. And we can argue over whether we should phase out the coal and then the gas and then the nuclear and finally the oil. That's what David Schwartzman, who we had on here early in the year, advocates. But the point is, instead of building them, we should be phasing them out because they're a danger. And then when it comes to nuclear weapons, we should demand that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty be amended to oppose instead of promote the so-called quote-unquote peaceful atom. And we should demand that the other goal of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is total nuclear disarmament, finally be pursued. And we have a new treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that really lays out how to do that. Over 100 countries have signed, and over 50 have had their legislatures ratify that treaty. So in the US, we should be demanding that the US take unilateral nuclear initiatives to indicate it is serious about nuclear disarmament. I'm talking about things like declaring no first use of nuclear weapons, which we don't, it's not our policy. It should be. Scrap the intercontinental ballistic missiles, which Daniel Ellsberg has been advocating, because they're just targets. They're not needed for deterrence. And then start reducing our total number of nuclear weapons toward a minimum credible deterrent. I mean, after you get above that, you're just bouncing the rubble, and nobody's left to even notice it. So that means, particularly with the U.S. unilaterally pulling out of the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty, that we should be demanding that the U.S. declare that they were wrong to do that and tell Russia we want to engage in renewing and updating those treaties. And that should go parallel with negotiations with Russia and the other European countries to develop trans-European security arrangements that include Russia and supersede NATO. So instead of a military bloc allied against Russia, and Russia has its little military bloc allied against NATO, we want to set up mutual satisfactory security arrangements, and that can open the door to disarmament. And also, if Putin can say he got his security agreements met, he could withdraw from Ukraine, and it would be politically acceptable, or at least rationalizable or justifiable to his political base, which is not so much the masses of Russia, but the elites. So I think, that's really important that we raise those kinds of demands. And, this is not something that the Democrats or Republicans even talk about. So that's why we need the Green Party, another reason. And then we had, this week, this leak of classified documents by this 21-year-old racist anti-Semitic gun nut trying to impress his social media track group. And he was given a high security clearance. I mean, don't you feel safer already? And we have to realize that men just as young and maybe just as, I don't know what to say, got their, a poor judgment and got their priorities screwed up. They are in charge of nuclear weapons, land-based ICBM sites, submarines, strategic bombers, and particularly field commanders who have tactical nukes. I mean, they could go rogue and start something on their own in this country, but also in Russia and every other nuclear weapons country. I mean, we're really lucky still to be here. Back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. ships had a blockade on Cuba, and there was a Russian submarine below them, and they started dropping depth charges. And the commanders of that nuke thought the nuclear war that submarine thought the nuclear war had started. So there were two military officers. They agreed they should launch their nukes at the U.S. And there was a political officer who also had to agree. And he said, no, we're not sure there's a nuclear war going on. Let's wait. So that's how close in that instance we came to nuclear annihilation. So like I said, this should be a top priority in our advocacy and activism. It's not even an issue with the Democrats and Republicans. And that's another reason why we need the Green Party. So let's take your questions and comments. Is that number of new commercial plants? Yes. I know the U.S. military has 160 reactors on Navy ships alone. That sounds right. And there's something like a dozen nuclear submarines at the bottom of the sea. Many of them American, some are Russian. I think those are the only two countries who've lost nukes at the bottom of the sea. But yeah, that's another nuclear danger. And my number was not the military reactors on ships and submarines. Richard Pink, do you think that burying nuclear waste in plastic containers along the shores of the Great Lakes is a bad idea? That is what they're doing. Yeah, it's a bad idea. I mean, there are nukes, about 30 miles northwest of here. There's 4 of them. Well, 3 of them, and then there's another one about 50, 60 miles west of that. And they're storing the nuclear waste on site. I didn't know about it being, maybe plastic containers for what they call low-level waste. The fuel rods and the other high-level waste is, I think, in concrete containers. But just to have that waste is a bad idea. And right now, probably the safest way to store it is on site as these nukes are decommissioned. They've been looking for a long-term repository somewhere under the earth. The problem with that is shipping that waste across the country. I mean, the anti-nuclear movement, we call that mobile Chernobyl. They looked at that place in Nevada. I forget the name of the mountain, but it turned out to be have earthquake faults. It was not safe, and they've been looking at a site in New Mexico, but there are problems with that. So moving the waste is a problem, as well as storing it on site where it was made. So we still don't have, and there probably isn't a good solution to the waste. I know Finland puts it in what is said to be stable geological formations under the earth for their nukes. And that may be the safest, but it's still fraught with problems. You know, generating this nuclear waste, some of which lasts for 500 million years. You know, we humans have only been around for 200,000 or 300,000 years, and no civilization has lasted more than 1,000 years. So we're really leaving our posterity, if they survive climate change or nuclear disaster, with a long-term problem. It's just, it's criminal. Scout Trooper 164. Oh, and what do you think of the mother of a 6-year-old killing a teacher being charged? I think that's smart because that was poor handling of weapons. I don't know the details of the charge, but the fact that a 6-year-old got a weapon with ammunition and was able to discharge it and shoot their teacher, yeah, the parent is probably responsible. So, you know, my first thought is, yeah, the parent should have some consequences and hopefully set an example for other parents that have weapons in the house. So I think it's smart. Heidi Gillette. Have you watched Michael Moore's latest film, 2019, Planet of the Humans, which gave a pretty dismal outlook on alternative non-fossil fuel energy solutions, especially massive solar panels and even wind towers? Yes, I did. I think it's overly pessimistic. You know, some of the concerns they have is, are there sufficient rare earth metals to do renewables? And there are. The real problem is, how do you extract them from the earth in environmentally safe ways that also protect the workers who do it? And that, I think, is the bigger problem there. So I think, you know, I can't remember the details now. It was 4 years ago, but, you know, I heard a lot of things in there that I just knew were wrong, knowing what I do know about solar and wind power. So there is a lot of pessimism out there about the possibility of switching to renewables. My concern is that, and this is something we talked about with David Schwartzman back in January, some of these people are just advocating, you know, that we lower our consumption, don't expand the productive capacity anywhere, including in the global south, and that would condemn billions of people to miserable poverty and early deaths. And I'd recommend David Schwartzman's work. In fact, there's one that was in Climate and Capitalism, and it was a critique of degrowth. That might have been the title. And, you know, he lays out, you know, why we should, certainly in the affluent global north. I mean, what he says is, and this is based on statistics, you can have the maximum feasible life expectancy for a country with about 3.5 kilowatt hours a year of energy per person. And the US has about 3 times that. So we can get more efficient and reduce this wasteful consumption. On the other hand, the global south, their power production from renewables needs to grow quite a bit so those people can live a decent standard of life. I'm concerned that Michael Moore's film and many other, articles and statements that are being made are basically saying uh, there's no solution to the climate crisis. It's not possible to transform our economy, so we just got to cut back and be poor. And I don't think that's necessary, and it's certainly not, I think, politically feasible because the poor aren't going to stand for it and they're going to fight back. So anyway, yeah, I did see the film. I thought it was overly pessimistic and had a lot of things that were just wrong. Yeah, Chris put the article from A Critique of Degrowth by David Schwartzman. It's in the chat. And I think that's a good place to start in considering this question. Scout Trooper 164, it's official. We're in Cold War II. The Pentagon is examining Discord, and we have boots on the ground in Ukraine. This is bad news. We have 14 boots on the ground. It's not even clear that might be the Marines stationed at the embassy, which is, we got them everywhere, even in Russia. So there is, speculation and some evidence that we may have special operators providing intelligence to the Ukrainians, but a lot of it seems to be out of country. So, we're in Cold War II. There's no doubt about that. And we've got to head it off. That's why I'm advocating that the U.S. Very publicly go to Russia and say, we got to renew these nuclear disarmament treaties, and we got to negotiate mutually acceptable security arrangements. Nominally, that's what Putin said he wanted before he invaded Ukraine. And with 150,000 or more troops sitting on Ukraine's borders, he made a demand that NATO pull back to its military deployment that it had when Germany reunited in 1991. And they wanted it done like now. And, that was a ridiculous demand. Russia wasn't serious about it. I think they were laying a narrative for their invasion, saying they were under threat by NATO. But we should call Putin's bluff. At the time, the U.S. did say, while we're not going to say Ukraine can't ask to be part of NATO, that's up to Ukraine. They were seeking to talk to Russia about security arrangements. And Russia, they had this ultimatum, and if they didn't get it, they were going to invade, and they did. I think, what the U.S. can do is, make these initiatives. And first of all, to Russia, because they got the most nukes, and they're right now being very aggressive in Ukraine, and as well as Georgia, Moldova, Africa. There's a civil war going on between two military factions in Sudan the last few days. One of those factions, which is not the military itself, is called the Rapid Response Force, which has Russians have influence in it. The Wagner Group is there. So what I'm saying is, Russia's being very aggressive. We need to talk to them, but we should also talk to all the nuclear powers, and also China. There's a lot of saber rattling going on by the U.S., which, provokes China, and then China responds, like the military exercise they did around Taiwan last week. So I don't think this Cold War is inevitable. We should seek mutually acceptable security arrangements and a detente, if possible. And so, the ball's in the U.S. court. We have a lot of leeway. We have such a massive military and nuclear weapons that we can make disarmament initiatives to show we're serious without jeopardizing our security in the least. And that's, what I think we should be advocating, that the U.S. take the first steps and then call, Russia in particular, but other nuclear powers to come to the table, and let's get in alignment with this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Let's just take them off the chessboard and, protect ourselves and our posterity. Rivet King 17, as someone who lived through it, what was the left's reaction to the fall of the Soviet Union and the global choice of an alternative? That's a good question. The left was divided. I mean, even then, you had a Stalinist authoritarian, basically the capital C communist bloc of left parties. And then you had the social democratic parties, which had more aligned with the West, like the SDP in Germany and the Labour Party in Britain. And then you had a third camp of independent socialists who said neither Washington nor Moscow. And they were saying at that time, and we had an organization called the Campaign for Peace and Democracy East and West that was advocating this, is that it was time to push disarmament, take up Gorbachev on his call for a common European home with much reduced military forces, and collect the peace dividend and use it for domestic needs and sustainable development around the world. And what happened was, I think the Stalinist left was confused. They were nostalgic for the Soviet Union. They thought the left had a big loss. Others on the Democratic left were saying this is an opportunity for disarmament and the peace dividend. And unfortunately, what's called the left in this country, the Democratic Party, it's not. It's a center-right party. In Europe, it'd be more like the Christian Democrats in Germany. Under Clinton, they expanded NATO and basically pushed into, got aggressive with NATO in Yugoslavia, particularly in Serbia and Kosovo, and basically made NATO into a global NATO that was a imperialistic force. And more of that came to fruition under Obama, particularly in Libya, although it was the French that really were the driving force behind that. Obama apparently was a little bit reluctant, but he went along. Of course, Hillary Clinton was pushing that. So the Democratic Party, quote unquote, left, they made the choice of what is now a Cold War. And the old communist left was demoralized and the Democratic left was weak. And we really didn't press our demands hard. After Reagan and Bush won, a lot of the liberal left was just happy to have a Democrat in there, even though it was Bill Clinton, who was, implemented in terms of domestic policy, neoliberal deregulation, free trade, privatization policies that the Republicans couldn't get past when Reagan and Bush were in power. So, be careful what you wish for. If you're looking at the Democratic Party to save us from the Republicans, sometimes they complete the Republicans' program. And now today we got a Republican Party that's moved way off to the right. This medication abortion drug, they're taking off the market, makes it very hard I was listening to a report this morning about how women in the South, in Florida, where they have 80,000 abortions a year, they're going to have to go not to Georgia or South Carolina or Alabama. They're going to have to go up north to get medical attention, which is going to squeeze these services and make it harder for women up north to get abortion services. And that's the Republican Party we got now. And so anyway, the left was not prepared to deal, wasn't strong enough to really pose an alternative that was for peace and democracy. And it's still what we need now. And unfortunately, the Democratic left is certainly, the independent left is certainly weak in the United States. It does have parliamentary representation in most European countries where they have proportional representation. So that would be the Greens and the Democratic Socialist parties coming out of either the post-Stalinist parties, communist parties that decided they would become democratic socialists, and the other parties coming out of more independent left traditions and Trotskyist traditions that are pushing a democratic left policy in Europe. They got representation in their parliaments, which brings us back to what I've been, uh, pounding away at since the end of the 2020 presidential election. We got to change our electoral system. We need to push for ranked choice voting for executive officers and proportional representation in legislatures. Then the Democratic left, the independent Democratic left, would have representation, and the debate would change. Imagine if the members of the Squad and some of those other Democratic Socialists in Congress, and a lot more that were independent, or they were part of a independent left party. Remember, AOC said at one point when she was still supporting Bernie Sanders in the primaries, in any other country, I would not be in the same party with Joe Biden. That's what she said back then. If we have proportional representation, that would be true. And we'd have a party on the left that could raise their demands in the give and take of Congress from a much stronger position than they have now, where the Speaker of the House, the Democrat, or the leader, now Hakeem Jeffries, has a lot of sway over those, over the progressive, the left wing of the Democratic Party, in terms of committee assignments and whether they're going to back primaries against those progressives and so forth. So, that's a long way to answer that question, but unfortunately, we had an alternative. The pro-democracy left was too weak, and we've got a Cold War. And in this country, we don't even have representation in Congress. And we got to change the electoral system to get that. Lee Showron. Now Republicans are trying to find a way to get Biden indicted, even if they have to frame him, since they think Democrats are doing it to Trump for a political purpose. Yeah, the Republicans, they don't care what the reality is. They're just going to make stuff up. So we're going to have a lot of hearings from the Republicans, and they're going to create a lot of, noise and smoke, and they're not going to be addressing the real issues that face us. And not that the Democrats don't have a lot of corruption. I mean, our system institutionalizes corruption by making public elections privately financed. So the Democrats, as well as the Republicans, go to the rich and the corporate interests to get the money for their campaigns, and then they owe those rich interests. And it's legalized bribery. That's why, in addition to changing the way we elect people, we should elect them through a public financing system. I'm for a system where once you qualify for the ballot, you get a grant. Everybody gets the same grant to run their campaigns. Level playing field, private interests have no influence. And then the politicians can, make their best case with that budget and let the people decide. That's another reform we need. Scout Trooper 164. Apparently, Supreme Court of the United States, Justice Thomas, was hiding billionaire gifts. I don't know what this means. I think it's enough more evidence of this legalized criminality, bribery. I don't know if that billionaire, we don't have, I guess, direct evidence that he was, pushing Thomas to make this or that decision. But, he was making sure Thomas feels good about the billionaire class. And the fact that he was hiding them, could create grounds for impeaching Thomas. Abe Fortas, who was a liberal justice appointed by Lyndon Johnson, he ended up resigning, but there was a move to impeach him for much smaller things like, taking a nice speaking fee while he was a justice, or teaching a class at a university and getting paid pretty handsome fee at that time. but those amounts were peanuts compared to what Thomas has been getting. So I guess that's the way the Democrats can push back against the Republicans if they want to do a lot of hearings and, you know, instead of legislating, you know, have examinations of corruption or alleged corruption. So we'll see how that goes. But Thomas is, he's a hypocrite. You know, he portrays himself as somebody who likes to take his vacations by riding around in I guess a truck, or maybe I'm confusing him with that basketball player, at least the RV. And that turns out not to be true. Vicky Corden, I'm scared. In Florida, almost no restrictions to buy assault weapons or any weapons. Yeah. Another thing that comes to mind is this crazy governor of Texas wants to pardon a guy that drove into a group of Black Lives Matter protesters and killed one of them, and was known on his social media for saying he wanted to kill blacks and Jews. And this governor, why am I forgetting his name? I guess because I don't want to think about him, is saying he's going to pardon this guy who was, you know, convicted of murder. He hasn't been sentenced yet, but I guess the technical question is, can the governor pardon him before he's sentenced? And apparently legally he can't. Yeah, I see Frankie Lee saying it's crazy here in Texas too. We got Republican Party is not just a regular, normal conservative party anymore. It's neo-fascist and openly racist and authoritarian, and it's a real danger. And I guess one of my beefs with the Democratic Party, instead of really focusing on defeating and crushing the Republicans. I mean, Biden should have landslided Trump, who's got, you know, nothing rational to say to the voters. And Trump, I think Biden could have done that by pushing, you know, very popular policies like raising the minimum wage. And instead, Biden tried to run in the middle. And now that he's in office, he wants to do bipartisanship with this neo-fascist party that tried to overthrow his election. It's not how you defeat fascists. You've got to defeat them, not work with them. And so it's scary because we got a Republican Party that's become neo-fascist and a Democratic Party that doesn't know how to fight them. Vicky Corden, the Fifth Circuit judge in Texas, needs to be impeached, or resting to. I'm not sure what you mean by resting to. It is judicial overreach. I don't know how to spell his name. Yeah, it starts with a K. I'm not going to try to spell it either. And I haven't read the decision, but I've read about it, and he's just making stuff up. I mean, he's really overreaching. And the Fifth Circuit has been really packed with these MAGA Republican judges who they have axes to grind. They're not sitting there trying to interpret the facts in the law and make decisions based on that. They've got ideological agendas, in this case, anti-abortion. And even the Supreme Court, I guess, stayed his decision until there can be more hearings. But, you know, that's a problem. The right-wing Republicans have got a lot of crazy judges into the federal judicial system, and they're a danger too. Via email, the French Supreme Court approved it, and now Macron has officially signed pension age increases into law. How do workers win when capitalists can ignore even massive protests like in France? Well, they can win elections, get more control in the legislature, get a left or progressive candidate elected in the next presidential election. Macron is very weak. So they can take the power electorally in France and reverse this decision. And a number of the other neoliberal reforms that the Macron administration has been pushing or administering. The street protests I expect will continue, and I think I've noted here before that the difference between now and 1968, when it was another crisis in the streets, the May-June events of 1968, back then there was a division between the labor movement and the old left parties and the new social movements around feminism and ecology and LGBTQ rights. And now they're united. I mean, this is a social and ecological. In fact, the five left parties have formed, they call it something like the Union, Social and Ecological Union. And the Green Party in Germany, France is very much a part of that. And so and the Greens in particular made a lot of gains at the local office. They have mayorships in major cities in France, I think includes Paris. So they have a route, and they better win, because on the right, Le Pen is also growing. The center cannot hold in France, and the left better get the power before the right does. So I think, the workers have to organize for the, next elections coming up in France, as well as keeping the pressure on in the streets and using those street protests as a way to educate and mobilize people around, popular, progressive economic and ecological demands. There's a lot of action in France around ecological issues, parallel to this pension protest. Scott Trooper 164, what do you think of Russia's terrifying new draft law? This could be either bad news for Ukraine or even worse problems for Russia, especially with them kidnapping Ukraine children. I think it's both. It's bad news for Ukraine because they're going to mobilize more people. This new draft law, basically, they're issuing by electronic means notices to people to report to the draft board, I think like within 25 days or something. And if they don't, they lose driving privileges, doing anything with the state, like getting a marriage license. So there are real consequences. And then there's, criminal penalties, and you can end up in jail. So I heard last couple of days, there's a lot more people running for the border, although they've closed the borders so that, they're going to have to find a sneaky way out if they want to avoid this new draft. And I think in Russia, there's a lot of tension. And I'm just going to give you some data points, and I don't know quite what to make of it, but Yevgeny Prigozhin, the guy that runs the Wagner Group, has decided to try to take over a political party called the Just Russia, which is mildly social democratic in its social and economic program, but very socially conservative and ultra-nationalist and pro-Ukrainian war. So that may signal he's looking to compete for political power or have his people in office, starting with the St. Petersburg City Council. But there'll be elections in 2024. Is it 2024? I think so, for the State Duma and the Russian presidency. So you got that political conflict. You have ultra-nationalist white Russians who are putting out this racist and anti-Muslim, Islamophobic screeds, and they've had street protests against a mosque being built in Moscow by Muslim immigrants from Asia and the Caucasian areas. And that's been amplified by, hate speech on Russian state media by some of these ultra-nationalist white Russian commentators. In response, the Volga Tatars in Tatarstan burned or set on fire a Russian Orthodox church. So you got ethnic tensions, and the ethnic minorities are being disproportionately sent to the front lines in Ukraine. There's a lot of disaction with that. And then there are more private military companies like Wagner Group being formed. The big oil companies, Rosneft and Gazprom, they've had these private military companies to protect our assets, but they are beefing them up. And some people think they're getting ready for a power struggle in Russia. So how stable Russia is, I don't know, but I'm just giving you some of the news on that. And if Russia, had civil war over, for power with all those nukes running around, that's terrifying. You'd rather see a more orderly transition post-Putin, but it's not clear that would be the case. And for Ukraine, throwing more cannon fodder at the front lines is bad news for Ukraine, no doubt. And the kidnapping of Ukrainian children is such a horrific crime. There's been a lot of reporting on this. Some of these children have been recovered. Parents have had to, because they can't cross straight into, for example, in Kherson, students were told they were going on a 2-week summer camp or camp in Crimea. And basically the parents had no choice. And then they were not returned to Kherson. And the parents would call, and some of these children are still in Crimea. Some were sent to Russia proper. And, one way or another, the kids and parents got reconnected. Now to get those kids, there were stories this week, I think in the New York Times, maybe it was the Washington Post, but, of mothers who had to go through Poland, Belarus, and then into Russia, driving, like 3,000 miles to get their children and then drive back and come back into Ukraine from Belarus because they couldn't cross directly through the Russian occupied areas to Russia. And it's been like 31 children. And the number of children abducted, the Ukrainians say they have a few thousand documented. Some say, it's tens of thousands. It's just a horrific crime. Now, how the draft relates to that, I'm not sure. I mean, the Russians say they're re-educating these Ukrainian children to be proper Russians, which is a crime of genocide in itself. And, some of the older children who may be 16 or 17 when they're abducted, will soon be 18, and they could be drafted and sent to the front lines to fight against their own country. So it's a terrible situation. Frankie Lee, Howie, do you think the TERFs and other transphobic types are being used as another boogeyman to scare the bourgeoisie further right? What can people do? I think the TERFs, those are trans-exclusive radical feminists. They have targeted groups on the left, socialist groups. The Green Party was targeted. Some of them came from the Democratic Party. In fact, I've seen Facebook posts from some of the TERFs that came into the Green Party. They said, well, we couldn't get our way in the Democratic Party. They wanted the Democratic Party's support for the Equality Act, rescinded, and they tried to do that in the Green Party, and we told them to get lost. So as far as scaring the bourgeoisie further right, I think it's not the bourgeoisie, it's the Republican base. I think the big capitalists, they don't really care about this issue that much, most of them. It's really about mobilizing and scaring people into supporting the Republican Party because, transphobic types, according to them, are, trans people have the trans agenda to convert their children into being trans people or gay people. And, so they're trying to scare the base and mobilize the Republican base to vote Republicans. So I think that's where most of the energy is going right now. And then what can people do? We got to stand up for trans people. We got to say trans rights are human rights. We should support the Equality Act, which the damn Democrats didn't pass when they had both houses of Congress because of that filibuster they wouldn't challenge. So, the Greens need to be really clear on that issue. Some Democrats duck on it, although the Republicans are trying to, make it a big issue. So We got to speak up. And, the danger here is, violence against trans people. They are murdered at a high rate, particularly trans women. And so that's, we need to speak up and defend them. Scout Trooper 164, this feels like the Russians are becoming fascist or repeating many mistakes of Nazi Germany from the past. History repeats. Yeah, Russia is moving from authoritarian to really totalitarian in terms of it totally closing up independent civil society, organization, self-organization, independent media, even just making statements. I mean, you got one case that's got a lot of attention where a girl in about sixth grade did a little drawing that showed Russian troops sending bombs at a mother and daughter in Ukraine, and it was an anti-war statement by a 12-year-old, and she's been taken from her parent. Her parent is being charged just for making an anti-war statement. That's where Russia is right now, and there is an anti-war resistance. There's an underground anarchist movement that's doing sabotage of railroads and throwing Molotov cocktails at recruiting stations. And some of these people are being caught and sentenced to long prison sentences. So there is a resistance. There's a Russian leftist named Ilya Butrekis who is with the Russian socialist movement. And when the war broke out, he had to flee because he was afraid, he'd be sent to prison. And he was in Turkey for a while. Now he's in Berkeley, California. He got a teaching job there. And he's written 2 articles on Russia becoming fascist. And one of them appeared in Tempest. Maybe both of them did. But Ilya would rate this. I'm going to try to spell his name and put it in the chat. But look up his articles. I think they're the best analyses I've seen of how Russia has evolved. He's pretty well known as a author. He wrote a book called Dissidents Among Dissidents, which is about the left, basically from the late Soviet period through the current place. And it's put out by Verso, which used to be called New Left Books. Let's see, I think I spelled this right. So if we can put that in the chat, then people can Google his name and look for his articles. And I already see somebody's put the, from managed democracy to fascism. Chris is fast. There's the name, Ilya Butrekis. So look for his writings. He's going to be on a speaking tour that the Ukraine Solidarity Network is organizing for the fall. He'll speak in Chicago at the Socialism Conference over Labor Day weekend, and then he's going to be in New York, in the Bay Area, and 1 or 2 other cities, along with Ukrainian leftists. And the Sotsialny Ruch, or the social movement, is going to tell us who that person is soon. So Ilya Butrekis is somebody you should read if you want to understand the political evolution in the move toward a fascism in Russia. Richard Pink, would you support a Chinese brokered peace in our time negotiated to end the war in Ukraine? Well, peace in our time is a quote from Chamberlain in The Appeasement of Hitler's Germany. And I don't think, China wants to broker this, but it's hard to figure out what they're doing. Their so-called peace plan was more a statement of principles. The first principle says all countries should observe, and it said pretty forcefully, I can't remember exactly how it said it, the territorial integrity, independence, and sovereignty of all countries, which implicitly says Russia should get out of Ukraine. The EU ambassador from China guess it was last week, maybe the week before, that China does not recognize Russian control of Crimea, which is interesting. On the other hand, Xi Jinping went to meet Putin in Russia, and they came out with a joint statement, a bunch of joint statements. One of them said, we oppose the deployment of nuclear weapons on foreign territory. And then a week later, Putin said he's deploying nukes to Belarus. I can't imagine Xi Jinping was happy about that. On the other hand, China's getting very discounted prices for oil because of the sanctions and the war. Russia can't sell that oil to the West as much, but and the price is discounted for China, so they're benefiting from it. On the other hand, China wants to keep its access to markets and technology in the EU and the US. So I don't know what China's going to do. A peace in our time that basically let Russia keep some of the land it's occupied, I think would be like Chamberlain's appeasement. It would be appeasement of Russia. And, as I indicated earlier, is being very aggressive, not just in Ukraine, but especially in Ukraine, but also in Georgia, Moldova, Kazakhstan. They went in there to suppress that oil workers' revolt. And, those were workers at plants by companies like Chevron and I know it's Chevron, a couple other Western countries. So I guess what I'm getting at is that what you have is competition and cooperation between these various imperialist powers. And so, I would support a peace brokered by China that the Ukrainians found acceptable. They are the ones under invasion. They're the ones being oppressed. They're the ones that get to define what is a just solution. They don't want to take Russian land. They just want Russia out of their land. So is China ready to go along with that kind of peace agreement? If they are, great. If not, I'm not so happy about it. So I don't know what China's going to broker or try to broker. Brazil was just there, and Lula said the same thing. They do want the West to stop sending arms to Ukraine, which, I see as negative. I mean, if the oppressed can't defend themselves, are you really standing up for the oppressed? So it's, and the other thing is, Xi Jinping has been talking about hinting that he's going to call President Zelensky of Ukraine, and he still hasn't done it. Last week, maybe about a week ago, he indicated it would be soon, but it hasn't happened. So it's hard to figure out what's going on. I'm just giving you, some of the news around that question. But as far as the peace agreement in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have to define, what is just for them. And then even that is, how long will it last? If you, for example, people calling for a ceasefire. Well, a ceasefire that freezes in place Russian-occupied territory is one thing. A ceasefire that allows Russia to withdraw peaceably is another thing. So a lot of people are calling for a ceasefire negotiations without being very specific. And what you've got is people like Medea Benjamin saying, well, the U.S. should use its economic and military leverage over Ukraine to force them into a land for peace deal with Russia, which to me is, two imperialist powers carving up Ukraine. And then you've got Richard Haas, the president. He's the outgoing president, but he's been president for a long time. On the Council on Foreign Relations has an article in Foreign Affairs this week saying that, we should support Ukraine's counteroffensive, but when it comes to fall, it's time for negotiations. And he's basically saying the same thing Medea Benjamin said. We should use our leverage to force Ukraine to accept some compromise. And I heard him say, even before this article was published on Morning Joe a few weeks ago now, saying that there would have to be, quote unquote, hard conversations with Ukraine after this counteroffensive, basically indicating, whatever you get or don't get, that's going to be the end of it, and we're going to scale back military support. And he said, quote, since when does a little country like Ukraine dictate to the United States of America? So, that was your imperialist mentality right there. So it's a lot of things up in the air. But I think the bottom line is, as internationalists, socialists, we should support the Ukrainian people fighting off this war of aggression by Russia. And take our lead from them, listen to them. Too often they're invisible in these discussions. And everybody's talking about what Zelensky or Putin or Biden said, or Schultz or Macron or Xi Jinping, and they're not listening to the progressive social movements in Ukraine, the trade unions, the feminists, the socialists, the anarchists, the environmentalists, who are saying, give us arms to defend ourselves, take back our land. We want your solidarity. Our struggle is just. They get left out of the discussion, or if they're brought up, some of the people that support Russia say they're run by the CIA, which is garbage, but that's sort of their standard thing. Whenever people rise up against oppression and it's against a power that is opposed to the U.S., these people say, well, those people can't be rising up. It's got to be the CIA without any evidence. So we got to get clear on what's really going on in the world. And people do rise up and fight for their freedom. Cole McMullen. Howie, what do you think of having a progressive tax on landlords to fund a conversion of apartments to housing cooperatives? I think it sounds like a good idea. So I guess the progressive tax would mean are we taxing income or property? If it's landlords, maybe you're talking about a progressive property tax. So when landlords amass large, assets in apartment buildings, they have to pay a higher tax. That sounds like a decent idea for me. I do say on housing, we should have rent control, particularly now after the COVID pandemic and the stall in building homes, and particularly affordable homes. And after the collection of massive amounts of apartment buildings by Wall Street hedge funds and private equity firms like it's either Blackstone or BlackRock or maybe both, who've become the biggest landlords in the country. So rent control and then public housing. We can build more units of affordable housing at lower cost through the public sector. But there we've got to repeal the Faircloth Amendment that the Clinton administration got through, which said we can't build any more units of public housing unless they're replacing other units of public housing that were destroyed, or taken down. So it just limits the number of public housing units. If we build up public housing so it's a major part of the market, now it's less than 1%. In many European countries, it's like 20 or 30%. That creates a yardstick in the market so that the private landlords have to compete with those public rents. And also in Europe, those public housing projects are open to everybody, not just low-income people. And so you have mixed income housing, you don't concentrate poverty, and rents come down across the whole market. So I think those are also solutions we should push. But the progressive tax on landlords, you can do at a municipal level, I imagine. So that's something you can do pending investment by states or the federal government in public housing and enacting rent control. Amy L. Sachs, Howie, will you have a program regarding the Indian Child Welfare Act and its probable destruction by R.W. Neoliberal SCOTUS? not sure what RW stands for. Will the National Green Party be issuing a support in support of its retention? I think a program on Indian right wing. Okay. Yeah, the Indian Child Welfare Act. I know you brought that up before, and I looked it up, and I think it is making it harder for Native parents to maintain their guardianship of their children. So it makes it easier for adoption or state agencies to take those children away. I'm not remembering many of the details, but I know it was not something that we should allow to happen. So, National Green Party issuing a statement. That's something that could be done. It's not the fastest process, but it's probably a good idea. And I guess what I'll say is I'll look into that again and maybe draft a statement and submit it and see if they'll issue it, or if not, make one on my own. Because I did look it up, and it was bad news. It shouldn't be enacted. Okay, we've gone an hour. We started a little late, but we're ending a little late too. I'm looking in the chat, and she gives some facts about the Indian Child Welfare Act, and that rings a bell. And there's a lot more to the story. And I forget the oil company's angle, but it was pretty nefarious. Anyway, we're going into the Earth Day to May Day period, which is traditionally a time when Greens do a lot of actions. What we're going to do here is on next Saturday, April 22nd, we're going to have Mark Dunley, who heads up the Eco Action Committee of the Green Party, talk about the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal, what we got to do about banning plastics, and just what's going on in terms of environmental action. So that's to commemorate Earth Day. And then a week later, on April 29th, we're going to, as we approach May Day, May 1st, we're going to have Bill Berry, who's a longtime union organizer, who's a Green from Baltimore, Maryland, and Natalie Monarez, who is a activist in the Amazon Labor Union in Staten Island. And it's probably Natalie, from what they tell me, is going to do most of the talking. I think it's going to be very interesting because she's at the forefront of the new union organizing that's being done independently of the traditional unions. So that's the next 2 weeks. They should be very interesting. And in the meantime, have a good week, everybody. And we'll see you next week.